And may the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. All right, we're in the 15th book of Israel, and we're going to be in chapter 22 this evening. This is a sermon given back on 8/15/15. 8/15/15. And the title of the sermon is "The Vatican, the Deceiving Serpent, will bring destruction upon the earth and all nations, but not the house of Yahweh." And of course, throughout the sermon, he goes a bit into their plan. In verse 2, he's talking about, kind of building up to the work that was being brought out. If you remember this time period here, this was when the Pope was getting ready to come to America to address Congress, and he was doing his work in Europe with the EU and everything. At that time, they were trying to push this global agreement for the climate change, which ultimately they did. 196 nations agreed, at that time to allow this thing. Now, in verse 3, he says, now the work that he's doing, and he's talking about the great priest that's bringing out the information here, was being held until the feast, but the feast is getting so busy that we don't have time to get these things in, and I've got priests lined up to bring these things that are really important for you to understand what is taking place in the world and how it's going to affect the whole world. And get this, it's the plan of depopulation. And it's kind of hard to imagine that they actually have a plan of depopulation. It kind of reminds me in their court systems how, when somebody's on trial for murder, there's different degrees of murder. And of course, if it's something that was planned out and calculated, well, that's the worst thing, right? Well, this is a planned out, calculated plan of depopulation. He said it's horrible what they've got planned, and I've been telling you this for 15 years or more, maybe 20. Now, he gets into a little bit of actually bringing forth some evidence, of that plan in this sermon, but understand that Yisrayl Hawkins understood this plan from the scriptures. It's not like he was watching the news and said, "Oh no, look what they're planning to do. I better get and warn everybody." The things that are in the news and that are brought forth kind of just more or less solidify what we already know to be the truth, and the truth comes from the scriptures. Never forget that. Never think that you can trust or rely on the information that you receive from this world. It is not reliable. The only reliable source of information is Yahweh's witness and His house. And that is where the information first came with this plan of depopulation. All right. So and he said it in this sermon here in verse 3. He said, I know I started back telling you this. He said 15 years or more, and yeah, it was much more. As you get in the dates here, he said it was in Abilene, and of course this where we're at right now, it wasn't even nothing here was even built when he started warning about this plan of depopulation. Okay, so but anyway, he said the services we'll try it at 9:15 for a while, and he says it may start earlier than that. If you feel well about it, I can make it. Now he says in verse 5 anyway. In verse 5 he says, anyway, we hope to continue at 9:15, but we're still getting behind after a few weeks, and we'll consider something else. There's a lot of stuff we need to still learn about and what's going to take place in Washington next month. Now remember, this is 8/15/15, and this was, remember all the information, everything that took place. It seemed like there was so much detail that Yahweh revealed about everything that took place with this spokesman of the divining serpent here coming to the United States and of course pushing this agreement. He says in verse 6, it's like the serpent now. He said the reason the devil was named, the reason Hillel was named the serpent, that's something else now. And he said you can get that in our book of the Unveiling Satan, and he actually gets into it a little bit more in this sermon. But he reiterates in verse 7 to be punctual. To be punctual. This is something that we have to continually rehearse. That we have to continually, make it a big deal for us. And he does, the witness, of course, makes it crystal clear here in verses 7 and verse 8 why this is so important. He says, now if you can, make it to services on time. Everything is very important. Did you get that? Everything is very important. So if services start at 9 o'clock, you want to be here at 8:59. No, get here earlier. Everybody else is showing up at that time, and it's a big crowd, and you're going to miss everything that the first young speakers are going to say. We're open a lot earlier than that, and really, I don't want to make light of this because this is really a serious thing. Everything that Yahweh offers to us on His Sabbath day is for our benefit. Okay, it's very disrespectful for us to show up late to services, or to be talking during services, or to be talking to the person next to you while the young priests are speaking. Praise Yahweh. We need to really look at our actions and analyze that, because it's not just that we need something for the children to do. This is Yahweh's work. Everything that takes place here is Yahweh's work, and we're showing to Yahweh our appreciation and our interest in His kingdom by showing up early, on time, and ready to listen. Because if we don't do that, we're not showing interest. We're showing disinterest. We're saying, yeah, whatever, Yahweh, see what you got. You know what took place with me last week? Let me tell you. I would tell you, distract the person next to you so that they don't get to hear services. That's something that really needs to stop. But he says He has count, and this is in verse 7, He has count of every hair that is on your head. Some of us make it easy for Him. But He says now, right now He has this count. In other words, it's an ongoing thing. Yahweh is keeping up with every little detail. All right, in verse 8, He says, now, how much more do you think of its importance to be punctual in getting to services on time and listening to everything, showing Yahweh that you are wanting to learn this and to be able to be a teacher? Because that's truly what we're showing when we come to classes, when we come to services on time, when we show up ready to listen, ready to learn. All right, that's what we're proving before Yahweh, is that we are wanting to learn this and to be able to be a teacher. Okay, so in His kingdom. Or would you be late for the classes there too? Okay, so you can't say, well, if Yeshua was speaking, I would be there on time. Yeshua is speaking. You understand He's guiding this work. Praise Yahweh. Yes. We ought to be able to realize that the things that are offered here at the house of Yahweh is the work of Yahweh. Okay, so think about that. Think about that every Sabbath. Yeshua is speaking. Yahweh is speaking. And He's invited you to come here and listen and to learn. And you and I, the whole family, right? He said, but would you prove that you're late for classes, whether it's coming to services or coming to work? It makes no difference. The same thing is being recorded in your actions of what you do. Okay, so it's a constant, thing that we have to work on. We can't grow slack in this. And if you're having troubles in these areas, I suggested that you get counsel, that you do whatever it takes to switch that situation around, because we can all make excuses, but Yahweh doesn't accept that. He lays before us a perfect opportunity, and he's told us to grab hold of it, not to make excuses why you cannot grab hold of it. All right, so in verse 9, you don't want to go to work in the morning? Well, you probably don't want to make it into the kingdom, because the kingdom is going to be a kingdom of workers in unity who are going to be taking this huge message, a wonderful message to the universe that will stop all wars and fighting. Well, we're learning here how to stop all wars and fighting. Believe it or not, every day. We're learning how to stop all wars and fighting. We're not learning, some kind of quick fix here. We're learning the details of becoming peacemakers. And by working side by side with each other and going through various struggles with each other, we learn that. This is the bigger picture that we need to be focused on. In verse 10, he goes back into this topic of why Satan is referred to as a serpent. He says, well, we'll be turning this Leviathan around, that Hallel, who was created or who was called a serpent because she sneaks in. All right, she sneaks in. And that's why Yahweh tells us to guard our minds with all diligence. That's why Yahweh tells us to guard our houses with all diligence, to guard this house with all diligence. When you're given a task, as a supervisor, you need to be very careful about what's going on under your supervision. It's something that has always, really impressed me with the witness, is his ability to know all the various details of all the various work that's going on in this house at any given time. And sometimes it's like I would marvel at that, because I would he'd ask me a question about something. I'm thinking, well, how am I going to explain this? He doesn't know, and then he would bring up something that I'm like, okay, how do you know that? How do you because he is very careful. He is very interested and concerned with the work of this house. So let's learn that lesson. Let's learn that lesson and also learn how to be protecting and on guard of everything that takes place here, because Satan sneaks in like a serpent, right? He says, she sneaks in like a serpent. She sneaks in and does her dirty work and then sneaks back out. And she does talk to you. What? Yes. Whether you know it or not, she talks to you. Now, don't get anything in your mind like you're hearing voices. Not like that. Remember the great apostle Kepha. What a great man this was, right? And everything. But you remember there was one time in particular that Yeshua rebuked some of the words that came out of his mouth. And remember the words that he used to do it. Get behind me, Satan. Not saying that man or that apostle was Satan himself, but the words he was bringing forth were not the words of the work of Yahweh. So we have to guard our mouth. Remember what Jacob tells us, and that all the emphasis in guarding the words that come out of our mouth. Let's not say anything that can possibly be used for Satan. We're not Satan's workers. We're Yahweh's workers, right? So let's not give in to those types of loose talk that can allow her words to come in and put doubts in people's mind, to put, worldly thoughts in people's mind, or whatever it might be. Because that's what she does. She wants to get your mind off of the work. She wants to get your mind on something else. Some kind of emergency, some kind of anxious thing. You got to get your mind off of this work of Yahweh. She wants to encourage you to leave the work of Yahweh. All right? Well, and she's got various ways of doing that. So be aware of that. When you arm yourself daily with this information, then you're aware of that. And when it comes to you, you understand where it's coming from. Yeshua wasn't taken off guard. Our overseer is not taken off guard. We have to become just like that. Not taken off guard, but aware that Satan is trying to put doubt in our mind. And to get us, worried about things, financial things, whatever it might be, And people get all caught up in this and think, I can't afford this and I can't afford that. And why can't, this person over here, he's got money. Why can't I have money? Well, any given one of us here in this room or in this house, I guarantee you there are many people in this world who would give anything they own to trade places with you. All right? Just think of it like that. Think of it like that. You can always compare yourself with somebody else and say, I don't have that. All right? You know, that's why the scripture says, be content. You know, is any of us starving to death? No. We all got clothes. Might not be the shiny, things that we like to wear in our imagination. But it's not the time for that. You know, the time right now is to learn what Yahweh wants us to learn. Okay? And if you come to his house seeking that, you're going to get it. Remember, Yeshua said, blessed are those who hunger and seek after righteousness. Because they're not going to go home empty-handed. They're going to be filled. They're going to learn and understand this plan. And then, praise Yahweh, and then you begin to realize, oh, what do you mean? I'm not even focused on these superficial things that will be in abundance in the kingdom. We get caught up with those types of things, and we get anxious and we get worried. We get worried that how am I going to do this or how am I going to do that? Yahweh will provide a way. All right, and go back and you think of Yashub and everything that he went through, and understand that he didn't understand exactly why he was going through those things at that time. We're here to be tested. So we have to be working towards that goal. Praise Yahweh. Remember that. Now, in verse 13, he says, let's get to the middle of here in verse 13. He says, in Matthew 7, to know them by their fruits, what they're bringing forth. Now get this. Righteous people don't bring forth murder. And, you could put your own name there. Instead of righteous people, you could put your own name there and say, I don't bring forth murder. Righteous people don't take a law out of the scripture that says don't commit adultery and throw it away. Righteous people don't do that. Well, we are righteous people in the house of Yahweh, are we not? We are practicing righteousness, are we not? This is not what we're here to learn. So we can't be doing this how do we bring forth murder if it's in our heart, if it's in our tongue? If that's what we're bringing forth within us, we need to do something to put a stop to it, because righteous people don't do that, and we are righteous people. All right. So don't commit adultery, and righteous people repent. That's what righteous people do. They repent and convert to Yahweh's laws. They don't throw them away like the Pope is doing. All right? You'll see this in their own 10 Commandments when it comes out. They got, I guess, 11 now. They're trying to figure out, some way of deceiving again, Well, in verse 15, he says, now that's your job, and we look forward to doing it. And, of course, this has to be our desire, that we look forward to doing this job. We ought to be able to see all the misery that we have seen in our own lives, that is going on in the world today, and want to do something about it. This needs to be our desire, that we're looking forward to this job. He says, I hope you're looking forward to it. Look forward to training as much as you're looking forward to that job. Okay, that means looking forward to getting to services on early, or getting to services early. Look forward to getting to work on time, early. If you shoot for early, you might make it on time. If you shoot for on time, you're probably going to be late. And that's just the way things work out. People like to give themselves a 2-minute window of things, and then somebody stops in front of them on the way to work, and, I was late because of traffic. No, you were late because you procrastinated. Yeah, we got to get over that and to look forward to being on time. Look forward to doing what Yahweh's asking us to do here. Because this is our training. This is training for the kingdom of Yahweh. In verse 18, he says, the Vatican speaker. When you hear the word Vatican now, which is coming out more and more instead of just the Pope, you can tell that the Vatican is the one telling the Pope what to say. Now, the Vatican is being controlled by Hillel. Remember that Hillel, and that's the reason you need to go back and read Unveiling Satan. Her name was Hillel, and there are a lot of things that we revealed about Satan and the devil in that book. This is in verse 18. we're told that serpent is the old serpent called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. Now, that part they leave off when they're trying to understand who the serpent is and the agency that so-called serpent uses. In verse 19, she was called a serpent, a snake, because it hides. It creeps, and before you know it, it has bit you. And then it starts running back off into the grass again. And it can't even, or he said, it can even get into your homes. Well, it's a great thing to compare the way of the Vatican does this. Okay, the Vatican, remember that was the way that it was described there in the beginning. The serpent was more subtle, more crafty than any beast of the field. In verse 20 says, by the way, the word Vatican, he says, are you ready for this? The word Vatican actually means the divining serpent. You know, how telling is that? You know, the more you look into these things, the more and more that it is absolutely exposed how accurate the scriptures are in their portrayal of things. You know, the way Yahweh laid this out is 100% accurate. Now, in verse 21, he says, the Vatican speaker on climate thinks that there are 6 billion too many of us. This is another one of their Nazis there. This is named Schulenhuber or something like that. But he was put on this committee, you know, and he had went out and said that there are about that the population, the Earth's population, needs to be under 1 billion, is what he said. So, you know, he went to the same college as Ratzinger. They're all trained in the same way. That this is, you know, back in the beginning we were talking about this plan. It's a plan of depopulation. They're all involved in it, and they're going to bring this forth. You know, Pastor caught this right from the beginning when they started talking about all this, that this climate agreement was designed for that purpose. You know, it has nothing to do with, you know, cutting greenhouse gases or whatever it is that they're trying to portray, the 17 sustainable goals of you know, great development or whatever. Has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with depopulation. All right, in verse 25 it says, I don't know how much evidence it would take to convince a Christian or even a Muslim that the scriptures are absolutely true. As the President Obama said, you really need to start reading those scriptures. He didn't change the Pope's mind or anybody in the Vatican's mind. They have their own Bible that they printed themselves, and they follow that. And of course, they add to it, they take away from it. You know, anything that goes against what they want to bring, they go ahead and sweep that under the table, and they say, well, these are the new rules. And they're always writing new rules to try to, you know, hide anything that has even the appearance of righteousness. But in verse 26, he says, those teachings went into the Bible. Yahweh saw to it that the rendition of the book of Yahweh, and that we find in Isaiah 34:16, that we're told to search out and read. Since I mentioned that a few weeks ago, he said we've known that we run out of books of Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. The press room ran out of books of Yahweh to sell. People are ordering these. You know, this is becoming more and more talked about as this showdown comes to a head. Well, in the let's look in verse 33. He says, in fact, every bit of this that I've got to bring to you, if you don't watch really closely and get it in your minds, you'll never understand it. Now, this is Yahweh's witness telling us this. We should believe it. We should follow his words very closely. So again, you know, when he tells us to be punctual, when he tells us to be on time, we need to listen to that. You know, when he says, hey, up here, listen to me, get this. You know, as he's been doing for the last 40 years. Or what, you know, that's all for a reason. That's all for a reason. It's very, very important that we understand everything that he's telling us, because he's laying it out perfectly crystal clear. The only thing that's going to stop us is us not coming to pay attention. The person, you know, distracting us, or us distracting somebody else, or, you know, thinking of a thought, and the next thing you know, you're daydreaming while he's speaking. You know, little things like that can really make a big difference. And then, you know, something's mentioned again later on, and you say, what? I've never heard that. He never said that. Yeah, he said it last week while we were being distracted over something. While Satan was trying to get us distracted over something. So we have to understand that, know what we're up against and know what Yahweh's called us here for. In verse 34, he says, you've got to have a connection with Yahweh to begin with, or you'll never understand it. Did you get that? So we had a whole sermon series over making this connection with Yahweh, but he says the way that you get that connection, as Acts 3:19 also says, is to repent and to be converted. Why? Because none of the wicked will understand. Okay, so we have to repent. We have to be examining ourselves to make that connection with Yahweh. Okay, so in order for us to understand this, we have to have that connection. No one's going to sneak into this kingdom like the serpent. In verse 35, he says, "You may think you're hiding something from Yahweh when you fool around with the people who left Yahweh and spit in His face." Yahweh says, "Separate yourself from them." All right, and I think He's made that abundantly clear to us. But, if we still want to have that connection and to try to justify that connection, you might think that you're hiding something from Yahweh. Well, you're not. And he goes through several excuses here. Well, they're my son, they're my daughter, they're my uncle. They're Satan's servants. That's who they are. And you are too if you support them. This is very strong language, but it's the truth. You're Satan's servants too if you support them. So you better get that in your brain, because you're shut off from Yahweh unless you repent and are converted. And then he says in the next statement, the kingdom has got to mean everything to you. Let that soak in. This kingdom has to mean everything to us. Remember what Yeshua told us, that he who puts his hand to the plow and then wants to look back over this, that, or the other, that he can still come on into the kingdom? No. He says he's not fit for that kingdom. He who loves mother, brother, sister, uncle, friend, relative, neighbor, whatever, more than this kingdom is not worthy of this kingdom. This kingdom has to be everything to us. That's a requirement. Okay, so we need to take that seriously and come to His house ready to learn. Because this kingdom is going to be the one that brings forth the change that we're all eagerly looking forward to. To end all the misery and suffering, not only on earth but in the universe. So, men of Yahweh, this is what we're training for, and that's why you came here tonight. So praise Yahweh. You're practicing righteousness as we speak. So if you all please stand at this time. I will have the great privilege and opportunity to turn the services over to a great and mighty priest in the house of Yahweh, the great Kohan Michael Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom, men. Please be seated. Please be seated. All right, let's continue on with this. Now remember, this is talking about the deceiving serpent will bring destruction upon the earth and all nations, but not the house of Yahweh. As we saw, the Vatican, the word Vatican means the deceiving serpent. Now, the Kohen didn't get to it yet, but let's see. Pastor was describing, he was talking about Acts. Acts chapter 1. Verses 8 through 10, here on pages 235 here, he gets into it. He doesn't really bring the whole thing out. Well, this is what it actually says. Acts 1, 8 through 10, he says, "At Abel you will receive authority." Now, this is when, remember, the disciples were there, and Yeshua was going up into heaven, and they were standing there, and the Malachim was standing there, and they were gazing up at him, and it says, "At Abel you will receive authority, once the word of Yahweh has come to you. For Yahweh's two priests who teach peace, and all who reverence Yahweh all who keep Yahweh's laws, will bear witness to the uttermost ends of the earth. And when he had spoken these things, while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly towards heaven as he went up, they finally understood that two men clothed in white apparel would stand up for them, who also said, "You men, why stand gazing into heaven? It will come to pass, this same Yahshua who is taken up from you into heaven will return to the one named Israel, as you saw him go into heaven." Is that beautiful or what? That is so incredible, you know. So we know that, you know, as the prophecies speak about, that Israel is directly influenced through the teachings of Yahshua Messiah. You know, he worked very closely with him in these last days. And of course, he's telling us, this is why we know whatever comes from Abel is exactly what the house of Yahweh upholds, and that's exactly what Yahweh teaches. So you can't go wrong, because remember, the house of Yahweh is the pillar and ground of the truth. Okay? Let's jump here on page 236 on verse 48 here. This is that write-up about Pope Francis. And he says, Pope Francis will call for an ethical and economic revolution to prevent catastrophic climate change and global inequality. Now, you got to remember now, okay, this is when earlier it said that on page 233 on verse 23 that the Pope is hoping to get commitments on this agreement in September. If you remember, all those nations got together and agreed with this, and you know, backed the Pope in this teaching. So he says, talking about this climate change and global inequality, not having to do with equality, of course, for the people who want to worship Yahweh, because that equality that they're looking for, of course, is only those who are Catholics. They're not worried about anybody else, you know. Because remember, the Pope even said, don't teach morals, because everybody has a right to do what they want to do. You know, it doesn't matter what is righteous. You just do what your conscience tells you to do. Now in verse 50 it talks about witchcraft in Revelations 9, of course, meaning pharmaceuticals and so forth. And so, you know, they teach this. They want the children to go out and commit sodomy, fornication, adultery, bestiality, and homosexuality, because they know that this brings diseases. You know, it brings us the STDs, which of course makes them money, because they can so-called treat these things with the drugs. And the pharmaceutical industry is literally making outrageous amounts of money on these things. And the people who they say, you know, really needs these things, now of course they can't afford them because it costs so much. But it brings money in their pockets, which of course puts it into the hospitals, brings money into the hospitals. And that's how evil this wicked system is. You know, it's the opposite of loving your neighbor as yourself. That's what Yahweh says, to love your neighbor as yourself. But Satan's way is to destroy your neighbor and make money on it, you know. And also, like it says in verse 51, many of the hospitals are owned by the Catholic Church and run by the Catholic Church, but the government and the schools are run by the Vatican, the Catholic Church, and that's a fact. He says they're running it right now. Even the Supreme Court is totally Vatican. All the decisions made in the Supreme Court are coming from this serpent, the dividing serpent. And remember, that's exactly what the scriptures say, is that the kings of this earth, remember, are ruled by the Vatican. They have this authority. They have this power. They infiltrate. They've always done this. See, they have always infiltrated different societies and stuff, different organizations, but they can't do this to the house of Yahweh. But what they would do, and they still continue to do it, because this is what they're trained in to do. They literally train their people to do this, you know. But they will go in, and people will join these organizations that are anti-Catholic, and they'll go in and they will tear them down from the inside out. You know, they join, they get into, they participate and act like they're really into this thing, and they get them put into high offices where they have more control over the organization, and end up bringing the organization down to where it no longer can operate. And so therefore that they get away with the opposition against them. and then they move on to the next target and so forth. But this has always been the sly way that the Catholic Church has always worked. And this is why they're so heavily involved in the political system. You know, they don't need a politician to come out and say he's Catholic, although bunches and bunches and bunches of them do nowadays. You can see it and you can tell and so forth, and they talk about it. But they don't need that. You know, they can have anybody that they won't go in, they're still going to do their bidding because they have control over them. And many times, you got to remember, many times the Catholics will go in and participate, you know, act like they are something when they're not, and go into, as I said, to infiltrate a certain area and to bring about the Pope's wishes and so forth, the Vatican's wishes. So now verse 53 says, this is what Constantine had when he changed the laws. He said, this is what you're going to do. There are no ifs and buts about it. You're going to worship this God right here. You're not going to keep the Sabbath appointments with Yahweh anymore. You're going to keep your Sunday appointments with the sun god. He says, you get it? This all came from the Vatican. The Vatican owned Constantine and gave him his orders to bring certain things about. And he, like the popes today, was a spokesman who said, this is what you're going to do. Now, you got to remember, the Sabbath was changed, but it was changed over a long period of time, okay? And it wasn't just like he came out and said, okay, here's the Sabbath. You know, Sabbath's done away with. You got to worship on Sunday, you know. Well, that's the orders he gave, but it wasn't something that took place right away, you know. It took a while, but eventually it did take over because people were scared to death, literally, because they would die if they would keep the Sabbath. So the thing is that if once a family member is converted over to Sunday to save their lives, then of course they taught their children to keep Sunday, and their children taught their children to keep Sunday, and so on and so forth. It went on from generation to generation to where it became an accepted thing. So all that is exactly how Daniel spoke about, that they would, you know, attempt to change these laws in the hearts and minds of the people. Now it says in verse 54, in the unprecedented encyclical, now he's continuing to read this article. In the unprecedented encyclical on the subject of the environment, the pontiff is expected to argue that humanity's exploitation of the planet's resources has crossed the Earth's natural boundaries, and that the world faces ruin without a revolution in hearts and minds. Well, of course, the peaceful solution teaches to change the hearts and the minds, you know, to the ways of Yahweh. But this is crazy because of the fact that the planet has resources across the Earth's natural boundaries. And we're saying that the Earth can't sustain itself. That, you know, is not true in the sense if Yahweh's laws are kept, then the earth can sustain itself. It's because of the sins of man. It's not the earth that's doing it. It's man bringing it upon himself, because man came from the earth. So, and we're going to return back to the earth when you die, right? Dust you are, to dust you shall return. So if you don't take care of the earth, of yourself, then, and you have no respect for the earth, as the peaceful solution teaches, you know, respect yourself and others and the environment. If you don't do these things, then of course these curses will come upon you. Okay, it's not like, you know, the law says, you know, do this or I'm going to curse you. No, you bring the curse upon yourself because you don't do what Yahweh says, you know. And in verse 55, he says, the much anticipated message. Now, much anticipated. It was anticipated by all the government leaders all over the world. They were awaiting this message that's coming from the divining serpent that sits on the 7 hills of Rome. The leader of the kings of the earth, the leader of the kings of the earth, they are waiting for that, okay? And jump down to verse 60. Here he says, anyway, it's going to anger certain people, he says. The encyclical will go much further. Now, he's reading again this article. The encyclical will go much further than strictly environmental concerns. Much further. Now remember, it's talked about global warming, okay? Global change of the climate and so forth. But he says it's going to go much deeper than that. Much further, says Vatican insiders. Pope Francis has repeatedly stated that the environment is not only an economic or political issue, but is an anthropological. And the word anthropological means cultural characteristics or customs, like religious customs, Also social and relationships, okay? As Pastor says, such as adultery. So anthropological means economic and social matters. Now, if you remember, you go back to verse 50, you see where, they want this social matters to take place. And it is economical for them, because when you practice sodomy and fornication, adultery and bestiality and homosexuality, which brings STDs, it brings money into the drugstores, and it brings money in their pockets when they have to go to the hospitals and stay in the hospitals and stuff. So it is an economical advantage to them for these things. So back to the article, you see it says here, it's also ethical. It's also an ethical matter. It says another one of the Pope's advisors, Archbishop Pedro Barreto Jimeno of Peru. Now, this advisor is saying that the Pope intends to cover all of these issues, including anthropology, or religious and ethical matters. And the word ethical means having to do with ethics or morality. Well, he's already said that no morality should be taught except that which comes from the Vatican, right? What they decide is for you to do, that is what you are to do. Not that you should have any morals yourself. That's totally frowned upon within the Catholic Church, because there are no morals. The Catholic Church is the most convenient religion of all. You just do whatever you want to do. You just go to church. That's it. These were the same laws, if you remember, that Constantine gave to the people and said, this is what you're going to do, and they put death penalties on it. And in this way, they can go out and arrest the people who were keeping the Sabbath, those who own the 7-lamp lampstand, those who wouldn't eat pork. They could arrest them and immediately confiscate their property. Whether they kept them in jail or whether they relented or decided to be a Christian or not, they still kept their property. And they said it was very hard to get anything back. And it was almost unheard of to be given back to them. Once they confiscated your property, it belonged to them. And they took lawsuits and years and years and years, and you'd be dead before you could even get your property back. He said, well, that was the law that was running this great holy Roman Catholic Empire. And that's how you got the Papal States, okay? That's how they ended up getting so much land and spreading out so much, is by going in on their crusades and taking over lands and then taking over people's property and so forth. They had total, complete control. And these are the things that Yeshua was talking about when he said that violent men have taken these things by force. They would go in and they would take over the land and literally force the people into subjection or die, Let's see. So he goes on here, look at verse 69 here. He says, that's the New World Order. The New World Order plans to depopulate the earth, okay? Before that, he talked about a little bit about history, about Kissinger, and about how he got the Nobel Peace Prize for what he had done, being involved with Vietnam and Agent Orange being sprayed on everybody and so forth. And so they knew what was going on. They praised him for these things. And then all of the people, the Cambodians who had fled and died and so forth in the wars. And he says, did the Vatican know about this? He says, well, yes, they did, but they did really, they praised these people for the things that they had done, but they kept these things under the scope of the news and so forth, of people finding these things out. But the New World Order, he says, that's the New World Order. That's what it's all about, okay? But they have plans to depopulate the earth. He's reading an article here, and he says, if I were reincarnated, I would wish to be returned to Earth as a killer virus to lower human population levels. That's what Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, said. And that's a very familiar phrase there, because anybody who knows anything about the New World Order and has done any study on it and so forth, that quote there should sound pretty familiar to everybody. But that's how wicked his mind is. If he was reincarnated, he'd want to come back as a killer virus to lower the human population level. This shows how wicked and messed up their minds are, that they would have that type of thought. that as if this is, it's like Yeshua said. Remember, he said they would think they're doing their gods a service, right? Well, that's exactly what they think that they're doing. That this is a great thing to be a part of this, to depopulate the earth. Well, this article continues, it says, world population is by all intents and purposes completely out of control. Plans are underway now, implemented by the New World Order elite. Well, world population, by all intents and purposes, is completely out of control. Well, maybe Satan's way, but it's not Yahweh's way. When Yahweh made man, what did he tell him? Be fruitful and multiply. He didn't say, whoop, I want to have two children to a family, and this thing comes. He said, be fruitful and multiply. He never said anything about limiting the population on this earth. And it's such a crock when they say that kind of crap because of the fact that the reason why it's populated is because everybody wants to join together in the city. And the scripture says, woe to those who join house to house, because they want to cram 1 billion people into one little small area of a state or a country someplace. Instead, they got the entire country that they could spread out, and everybody could have plenty and plenty of land. This earth could hold trillions of people, if they would just spread out, but they don't. And of course, this is what Yahweh made. It's kind of like Pastor said earlier, kind of like he said earlier back here, he said about their gods. He says, on verse 21, I think it is, he said, he says, the Vatican, he's talking about the Vatican, a Vatican speaker on climate thinks that there's 6 billion too many of us. He says, did you get that? They think 6 billion people need to be destroyed for their earth to survive. Their God is not big enough to make the earth bigger for them. Their God doesn't have power at all. And they're finally seeing that, And that's the size of it. The God that they worship has nothing, no power at it all whatsoever. And they can't even think about these things. It's beyond their scope of reasoning to even comprehend. Because like Daniel said, the wicked would never understand any of these things, Okay, verse 71 here continues on. He says, these are the ones that the Catholic Church calls the elites. The Vatican calls the elites. What we read, to depopulate the planet's 6 to 7 billion people to a manageable level of between 500 million and 2 billion. Well, you remember the scriptures. Pastor says, I brought that out years ago. The population shown in the scriptures would be depopulated to about 2 billion people. He says, isn't that something? Well, that's exactly what he had been saying. 2 billion people. That's what they want to do. So he says, the article says, there are many ways and methods of depopulation that are being employed today. Notice that. The 3 primary of which include unsustainable exploitative international development, which leads to massive hunger, starvation, and famine worldwide. And you see that going on today. The very same thing. People are starving. You see that they run things in the news for a little while, and then you just totally forget about it. You don't even hear anything else about it. It's just like it goes on to something else, and things are forgotten about. But, this hunger, this starvation is still going on throughout the world. I was reading something before. They said it'd be so easy to stop it. How much it was? How much the problem is not having the food. The food is there. It's getting the food to the people. That's the problem. That's what we won't go any further. They'll deliver the food, and the food will sit up there, and the governments will guard the food to make sure that no one comes and steals the food. They don't deliver it to nobody, but they guard it, okay, and they save it for themselves and so forth. But they won't disperse it out there. And they said, I was reading an article one time where it said the world's population, it could take care of everybody for $1. All people have to do is give $1, and that would be enough to totally disperse all the food and to eliminate the starvation that's out there. Because it's just a matter of doing it properly, of getting the food out to the people, but they don't do that, of course. So the earth is being depopulated by 40 million deaths annually right now, because people are dying, at least 40 million deaths annually from starvation and so forth. So this depopulation is going into effect, just like they said, and this is the wickedness of their minds, that, they'll wait all of their life to see these things, to work towards these things coming to pass. And to them, it's such a great thing that they're working for, you know? It's just their minds are just so messed up. It's incredible. So he goes on and says the fomentation of war, hatred, and of course that goes on, you know, Cain started that, remember? War and hatred and so forth, and it built and it built and it built to what we see today, as Yahweh said. You're going to have continual war. That's all it's going to be. Well, hatred, military procurements throughout the nations, leading to millions of deaths worldwide, and finally the creation and spread of infectious diseases. Now, this is in the writings, okay, of people who are in the know. Write these things and let these things be made known. But they actually create the spread and spread these infectious diseases. Remember, we saw that with that latest virus that they said, is spread by mosquitoes and so forth, right? The Zika virus and stuff. All these things are it sure is amazing how the Center of Disease Control can control their diseases so well, isn't it? I can tell you what flu is going to break out. It's amazing how much money that they can make on flu shots, you know? Because they've got it all planned out. But people are so gullible that they're too blind to even see them. And that should be one of the most simple things of all for anybody in the world to be able to look at and to see and understand. But they can't even comprehend it. So notice in verse 76 he says, continuing reading with this article, he says, leading to global pandemic, plagues, pestilence, and on an unprecedented scale, notice, on an unprecedented scale. See, this is their agenda, okay? If you've heard of Agenda 21, this is their agenda. But they're too stupid to realize that it's going to affect them. You know, it's like these war hawks, okay? You can't explode a nuclear weapon on the other side of the world and think it's not going to affect you on this side of the world. You know, eventually it's going to come back to you and harm your health, you know, but their minds are not capable of seeing beyond any further than I think they can reach out their hand, if they can see that far, you know, because of the fact that their minds are just blinded. And that's what Satan said. You know, Yahweh said Satan has the minds of the world blind. They can't see these things. They can't comprehend that their hatred for one another is killing themselves, is actually bringing their own destruction upon them. But they're too blind to see it. He continues with this article. He says, other methods used include the buildup and use of nuclear, chemical, and biological agents, weapons and warfare, the poisoning and contamination of the planet's food and water supplies. Now, if they're going to poison and contaminate the planet's food and water supplies, what are they going to eat and drink themselves? Duh! You know, it's just so crazy, man. The introduction and use of deadly pharmaceutical drugs in society. Boy, you see that every time you turn on the news, right? Just listen to the commercials. But if you go out on the street and ask anybody, if they listen to these commercials or watch these commercials, none of them will pay a bit of attention to it. Because they're jumping through the flowers and playing their flutes and strumming their guitars and smiling at one another and eating at picnics. Meanwhile, the guy behind is telling them if you take this drug, it's going to kill you. But ask your doctor if it's right for you. See if it's your time to go see the grave, you know. Okay, so they got that one down packed for sure. Weather modification and the triggering of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis through electrical, magnetic, psychotropic weapons both on Earth and in space. Of course, they talk about HAARP that does that. The promotion of homosexuality to limit population growth and spread the deadly AIDS virus. It used to be, you remember, AIDS only took place only homosexuals got AIDS when AIDS first came out, remember? That's how they introduced it into society. And everybody thought, you ain't worry about it, you know, now homosexual, ain't got to worry about that disease, you know? And then it used to be, don't worry about it. And then later on, they figured out, oh, man, it shows up 50 years later, you know? Well, now it's 10 years later. Now it's 5 years later, you know? Now who knows how often it is. It could be within a year as steady as this stuff has grown, because the virus doesn't stay the same, remember. Viruses mutate, and as they mutate throughout the society, and this is spread from person to person to person to person, every time it spreads to another person, it grows stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. This is the reason why you see even the flu. Some people die from catching the flu. You know, when your body should be able to fight off the flu. You know, you should get a little bit, down, but your body should be strong enough to fight that off and get rid of it. But it's not. Some people, it actually kills them. Thousands and thousands of people die from that kind of stuff. Why? Because you see it. When you get sick and something's going around, it hits you hard because it's been mutated so much, you know? And so your body really has to fight these things off. Okay, jump over to, look at verse 82. It says here, Malachi 4, verse 1. For behold, the day comes that will burn like an oven. He says, well, we've got the means to do that in this generation, as the prophet said. And all the prophet, yes, all the proud and all those who do wickedly, that's the Vatican, of course, who sits on the 7 hills. They're fully described in Revelation 17. Then he goes on, he says, the city that rules the kings of the earth will be in this country next month to dish out the orders for you to follow. And that's what, of course, was talking about the Pope's visit. Now, these are done secretly, he says. They're done secretly, but you'll find out by the fruits that is what he actually tells you to do. And notice, he says, he knows the ones he can depend on already. He's talking about the Pope there. And he does. This is the reason why you have the Pope's, dignitaries from all over the country go and visit the Pope. And these things are done in secret. They sit down and they talk and so forth, and they send their representatives back and forth, back and forth. This is also why you have the nuncios, papal nuncios. I'll read you a definition here. This is nuncio from, let's see, I think you can read that. It says, a nuncio is an ordinary and permanent representative of the Pope, vested with political and ecclesiastical powers, accredited to the court of a sovereign, or assigned to a definite territory with the duty of safeguarding the interests of the Holy See. Now remember what we just read here. Pastor says, and he knows the ones he can depend on already. This is these nuncios. This is why they have this position. The special character of a nuncio, as distinguished from other papal envoys, consists in this, that his office is specifically defined and limited to a certain district wherein he must reside. His mission is general, embracing all the interests of the Holy See. His office is permanent, requiring the appointment of a successor when is recalled and so forth, and his mission includes both diplomatic and ecclesiastical powers. So these are the ones who he knows he can depend on. Now they have to give certain reports, and that's what this other part is talking about here. The reports that they give. It says the official reports concerning their entire field of work sent by the papal nuncios to the Pope or the Cardinal Secretary of State. The contents of these dispatches are in accordance with the commission received by and so forth, but he says it's for the protection of all the interests of the papacy. Now notice the objects, right here it says, the objects of the reports are, 1, to give the most exact information possible concerning all political and ecclesiastical occurrences which might be of an importance to the Pope or the Cardinal Secretary of Secretary of State. Okay. Number 2 is to give exact information concerning the action the nuncios have taken with respect to such occurrences. And 3, to send news concerning the princes to those whose courts are accredited and concerning the persons who are in personal contact with the person, anyway, keeping track of where everybody's going on and so forth, okay? But the thing is that the Vatican has a system set up to where they know exactly what's going on in all countries, everywhere, what every politician and so forth desires to do. And so this way they can keep control over everything that goes on. And they do a fantastic job. Because remember, Satan has the whole world deceived, okay? This world is under the control of Satan. And her government is set up in such a way to mimic what Yahweh does. Because think about it. Satan has the whole world deceived, and she's got control of all the earth, all the kings of the earth, right? But that's earth, big deal. What is earth compared to the universe? That's what Yahweh's got. He's got the whole universe. You know, he can control everything. But Satan really thinks that this is something that she's got really control of. But remember, her whole agenda is to destroy you, to destroy mankind, okay? Because she knows the potential that each and every one in the house of Yahweh has. And that's what she's after, is trying to destroy that. So she's working very diligently. But we're fixing to have confessions, so we're fixing to put her down anyway and gain a little bit more strength on the Sabbath day, right? So may Yahweh bless you, man, if you go...